Arab millionaire buys humble woman to have a child, but fate prepares a surprise. Thrilling, the 40th floor of Alfahim Tower pulsed with an almost palpable tension. John Alfahim remained motionless behind his solid mahogany desk, his dark eyes fixed on the young woman seated before him. Lucy maintained perfect posture, her delicate fingers interlaced in her lap in a gesture that betrayed her anxiety, though her face remained serene. "So, Miss Morrison, do you understand exactly what I'm proposing?" John's voice was deep and controlled, each word chosen with surgical precision. Lucy let her eyes wander across the New York City skyline through the office windows. The setting sun painted the skyscrapers in golden hues, creating a cruel irony, all that beauty contrasting with the most challenging moment of her life. "You're offering me a marriage contract," she responded, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "An arrangement that would benefit us both," John rose, putting his $300 million of personal fortune into motion. His impeccable Italian suit accentuated his imposing figure as he approached the window. "Precision is important at this moment, Miss Morrison. I'm offering far more than a simple contract. I'm offering stability, security, and a guaranteed future for your family." Lucy's heart constricted at the thought of her mother confined to a hospital bed, fighting against an aggressive cancer that consumed not only her health, but all of the family's savings. Medical bills were piling up, and insurance had run out months ago. "Why me?" The question escaped her lips before she could contain it. "You could choose anyone." John turned to face her, his expression a studied mask of indifference. "Because you're intelligent enough to understand that this is business, not a fairy tale. Because your education and demeanor are suitable for the role you'll need to play. And because, unlike other candidates, you have a real motivation to accept this arrangement." Lucy tasted the bitter truth in his words. Her family stood on the brink of ruin. The experimental treatment that could save her mother remained out of reach until now. "And what exactly do you gain from this, Mr. Alfahim?" A nearly imperceptible smile touched John's lips. "Legitimacy. A marriage to an educated, respectable American would silence rumors about my suitability to assume the board presidency. My father is retiring, and there are expectations to be met." Lucy stood, her heels sinking into the luxurious carpet. "So, that's it? A business deal disguised as marriage?" "Precisely." John returned to his desk, opening a leather portfolio. "The contract stipulates all terms. You'll have access to a joint account for personal and family expenses, including your mother's treatment. In exchange, we expect absolute discretion and your presence at important social events. After 5 years, we can dissolve the marriage amicably, and you'll retain a considerable pension." Lucy's hands trembled slightly as she took the contract, reading each page that detailed how her life would unfold over the next 5 years. Her freedom had a price, and it was printed on letterhead paper. "And if I fall in love with someone else during this period?" she asked, testing the boundaries of their agreement. John's eyes darkened. "Then I suggest you keep your feelings to yourself. Infidelity would void all contract benefits." Lucy studied the man before her, powerful, controlled, and completely emotionally closed off. He represented everything she never wanted in a partner, but her mother was dying, and principals didn't pay medical bills. "And you," she challenged, "must you maintain fidelity as well?" "Naturally. This agreement works both ways, Miss Morrison. Mutual discretion and respect are essential." Lucy closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of her mother's hopeful expression when she mentioned the possibility of new treatment. She thought of her younger brother, who would need support to finish college. She thought of all the nights she spent awake searching for a way out of their impossible situation. "I accept," she finally said, her voice firm despite the weight in her heart. "But with one additional condition." John raised an eyebrow, a gesture he clearly wasn't accustomed to making. "And that would be?" "Never try to control my heart," Lucy declared, lifting her chin in defiance. "I can commit to every other clause in this contract, but my feelings remain my own." For a moment, something flickered in John's eyes. Surprise, perhaps even admiration. but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual professional mask. "Your feelings are irrelevant to this arrangement, Miss Morrison. As long as you maintain appearances in public, what happens in your heart doesn't interest me." Lucy picked up the pen he offered her, thumb unconsciously caressing its smooth surface. It was a Mont Blanc, probably worth more than her monthly rent. With a deliberate movement, she signed her name on the indicated lines, feeling the weight of each letter. "Welcome to the Alfahim family," John said, his voice neutral as he collected the documents. "My assistant will contact you to arrange the wedding details. We'll keep the ceremony discreet but elegant." Lucy stood, smoothing her pencil skirt with precise gestures. "Thank you, Mr. Alfahim. Or should I start calling you John?" "John is fine, considering the circumstances." He accompanied her to the door, maintaining a professional distance. "And Lucy, one last thing." She stopped, turning to face him. "This arrangement will work better if we keep our expectations realistic. We're not characters in a romance novel. We're partners in a mutually beneficial arrangement. Remember that." Lucy smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't worry, John. My heart is perfectly safe from you." As the elevator descended, Lucy allowed a single tear to roll down her face. She wiped it away quickly, hardening her heart. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. At least her mother would have a chance to survive, and her brother could continue his studies. The price of her freedom was high, but she would pay it. And as she did so, she would swear to keep a part of herself untouched, that part that still believed in true love, even if she could never experience it with the man who would now be her husband. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and unspoken expectations. Lucy studied her reflection in the bridal suite mirror, adjusting the wedding dress that cost more than her annual salary. The white fabric embraced her curves elegantly, but her eyes remained fixed on her face, searching for traces of the woman she used to be. 3 weeks had passed since signing the contract. 3 weeks of frantic preparations, meetings with wedding planners, and intensive lessons in Arab etiquette. Her previous life felt like a distant dream. "You look beautiful, honey." Her mother Claire's voice, though weak, carried determination. Seated in her wheelchair, she appeared stronger today, the new treatment already showing promising results. "Mom, you should be resting." Lucy turned, concern etching her features. "And miss my only daughter's wedding." "Not a chance." Claire grasped Lucy's hand, her thin fingers squeezing with surprising strength. "Are you certain about this?" Lucy swallowed the lump in her throat. "Absolutely. The treatment's working, isn't it? And Daniel can stay in college." "But what about you? Your happiness?" "I'll be happy seeing you get better and Daniel achieving his dreams," Lucy interrupted gently. "Besides, John isn't a monster. He's proper." Proper was a safe word to describe her soon-to-be husband. During the past weeks, their interactions had been limited to formal meetings discussing wedding details and carefully orchestrated public appearances. John remained unfailingly polite, efficient, and completely distant. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "5 minutes, Miss Morrison," a female voice announced. Lucy helped her mother back to the ballroom where Daniel waited to escort her to her seat. Her brother, at 19, looked older in his rented tuxedo, his eyes carrying a mixture of gratitude and concern that broke Lucy's heart. "You don't have to do this," he whispered while embracing her. "Yes, I do," she replied with a gentle smile. "Now go take care of Mom." Alone in the hallway, Lucy took a deep breath, preparing for the moment that would forever change her life. The music began to play, and she walked toward the main ballroom. John waited at the improvised altar, his imposing figure dressed in a custom-made suit that probably cost more than a car. His face wore the appropriate expression of a satisfied groom, but his eyes remained unreadable as she walked down the aisle. Lucy observed the guests. On the right side sat important executives and their wives, all curious to see the American bride who had captured the elusive John Alfahim. On the left, her small family and a few close friends looked out of place amidst such luxury. The ceremony was brief and elegant, exactly as planned. They exchanged traditional vows, their words echoing with a formality that masked the true nature of their arrangement. When John leaned in to kiss her, his lips barely touched hers, a kiss as controlled as everything else in his life. The reception that followed proved an exercise in diplomacy. Lucy smiled, danced, and conversed with dozens of strangers, aware of John's watchful gaze following her every move. She played her part, and judging by his satisfied expression, she played it well. During their first dance, something unexpected occurred. As they moved to the soft waltz, John spoke, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You're an excellent actress." Lucy met his eyes, surprised by the observation. "Years of corporate sales help." "No," he replied, turning her with studied precision. "It's more than that. You have a natural gift for this, for making people believe." "Including you?" A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed his eyes. "I never completely believe anything, Lucy. That's how I've survived so long in this world." "What a lonely existence," she commented before she could stop herself. The hand at her waist tensed slightly. "Loneliness is preferable to vulnerability." Before she could respond, the music ended, and John guided her back to the main table with his usual courteous efficiency. The moment of near intimacy had passed, leaving Lucy intrigued and slightly disturbed. The evening progressed, and finally the time came to depart. Lucy bid farewell to her family with tight hugs and promises of frequent visits. Her mother cried, Daniel tried not to cry, and Lucy maintained her composure through sheer willpower. The limousine ride to the airport passed in silence. They would spend their honeymoon at John's private villa in the Hamptons, a business decision to maintain privacy while establishing their public image as a couple. As they drove through the night, Lucy noticed John watching her, his expression thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" she asked. "You surprised me today," he admitted. "Your composure with the board members, the way you handled my aunt's rather pointed questions about children. You're more capable than I anticipated." "I'm full of surprises, Mr. Al-Fahim," she replied, allowing a hint of challenge to color her voice. "Perhaps you should have done more thorough research before proposing our arrangement." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps, though I suspect no amount of research could have prepared me for the reality of you." The weight of his words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to explore. Lucy turned to watch the city lights blur past her window, wondering what other surprises awaited in this elaborate charade they'd created. When they arrived at the villa, John's staff had already prepared separate bedrooms. He showed her to hers with impeccable courtesy, maintaining the professional distance that defined their relationship. "Good night, Lucy," he said, pausing at her door. "You performed admirably today. Your family should be proud." "Good night, John," she responded, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Thank you for keeping your word about everything." He nodded once, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Lucy entered her room and slowly sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing her carefully maintained facade to crumble. She had done it. She was now Mrs. John Al-Fahim, a title that would save her family but cost her the freedom to love truly. As she prepared for bed in the luxurious surroundings that would now be her life, Lucy wondered if she would ever get used to the weight of the rings on her finger. Rings that symbolized not love, but duty. Outside her window, the ocean waves crashed against the shore, their rhythms steady and unchanging. Like her new husband, they remained constant, powerful, and ultimately unreachable. Lucy closed her eyes, preparing herself for the reality of her new life, a life of privilege and purpose, but one devoid of the one thing she had always dreamed of: real love. Little did she know that fate had other plans, and the carefully constructed walls around both their hearts would soon face challenges neither of them could anticipate. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hampton villa, catching Lucy off guard as she entered the kitchen. She hadn't expected to find John there, dressed casually in dark slacks and a white button-down shirt, reading something on his tablet while drinking coffee. "Good morning," he said without looking up, his voice carrying its usual professional tone. There's fresh coffee in the pot. The housekeeper left breakfast in the warming drawer. Lucy padded to the coffee maker, grateful she'd thrown on a silk robe over her pajamas. I didn't expect you to be here. Don't you have an empire to run? The empire can survive a few days without my physical presence. John finally looked up, his dark eyes assessing her with that unreadable expression she was beginning to know well. Besides, we need to establish certain routines. The media will be watching our every move when we return to the city. Of course, everything in their lives had to be choreographed, even their morning coffee. Lucy poured herself a cup, adding cream and sugar while feeling John's gaze on her back. Your mother's first treatment session is scheduled for tomorrow, he said, his tone carefully neutral. I've arranged for a car to take you to the hospital, unless you'd prefer to drive yourself. Lucy turned, surprised by his consideration. Thank you. A driver would be helpful. I'm not sure how Mom will feel after the treatment. John nodded, returning to his tablet. I've also taken the liberty of having your things moved from your apartment. The movers will deliver everything to the penthouse tomorrow. The penthouse? Lucy sat across from him, warming her hands around the coffee mug. I thought we'd be living here. This is a vacation home, he explained, as if speaking to a child. Our primary residence will be the penthouse in Manhattan. It's more convenient for both our schedules, and it's what people expect. What people expect? Those three words seemed to govern every aspect of their new life together. Lucy sipped her coffee, contemplating the man before her. Despite his casual attire, John maintained an air of rigid control that seemed to permeate everything around him. Tell me, what do you expect, John? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He looked up sharply, something flickering in his eyes before disappearing behind his usual mask. I expect you to fulfill your part of our agreement. Nothing more, nothing less. That's not what I meant. Lucy leaned forward suddenly, determined to crack his perfect facade. What do you expect from life? From yourself? There must be something you want beyond board approval and maintaining appearances. For a moment, genuine surprise crossed his features. Then his expression hardened. What I want is irrelevant. We all have roles to play, responsibilities to fulfill. Personal desires are a luxury I cannot afford. That sounds rehearsed, Lucy observed. How long have you been telling yourself that? John stood abruptly, his movement betraying a rare moment of discomfort. I have calls to make. We'll leave for the city tomorrow morning. Be ready by 8. He strode from the kitchen, leaving Lucy alone with her thoughts and the lingering scent of his expensive cologne. She hadn't missed how he'd avoided her question, or the flash of something. Pain, regret? In his eyes before he'd shut down. Later that afternoon, Lucy wandered the pristine beaches behind the villa, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. The ocean breeze carried the salty scent of freedom, a stark contrast to the gilded cage she'd willingly entered. Miss Morrison, Mrs. Alfahim, a voice called from behind her. Thomas, John's personal assistant, approached with a tablet in hand. Mr. Alfahim asked me to review your schedule for the coming week. Lucy suppressed a sigh. Even her free time would be scheduled now. Of course, Thomas. What's on the agenda? Monday morning you accompany Mr. Alfahim to the hospital for your mother's treatment. Tuesday evening there's a dinner with the board members and their wives at Leodan. Wednesday. As Thomas rattled off her carefully planned week, Lucy noticed movement on the villa's upper balcony. John stood there watching her, his expression unguarded for once. Even from this distance, she could see the weight of whatever burden he carried. Thomas, she interrupted gently, how long have you worked for John? The assistant blinked, surprised by the personal question. 8 years, ma'am. Has he always been so... She searched for the right word. Controlled? Thomas hesitated, loyalty warring with something else in his expression. Mr. Alfahim has always been extremely dedicated to his responsibilities. That's not what I asked. The assistant glanced toward the balcony, where John had already disappeared. There was a time, years ago, when he was different. Before his brother's accident. His brother? Lucy's heart skipped a beat. In all her research about the Alfahim family, she'd never found any mention of a brother. I'm sorry, ma'am, I shouldn't have mentioned it. Shall we continue with the schedule? But Lucy barely heard the rest of Thomas's carefully planned itinerary. Her mind raced with this new piece of information. A missing brother, a hidden tragedy that might explain the walls John had built around himself. That evening, they shared a quiet dinner on the terrace, the sound of waves filling the silence between them. Lucy watched as John methodically cut his food, each movement precise and controlled, just like everything else in his life. "Your brother," she said softly, noting how his knife stilled for a fraction of a second. "What was his name?" John's jaw tightened, but he continued eating as if she hadn't spoken. Just when she thought he would ignore her question entirely, he answered, his voice barely audible over the ocean sounds. "Adrian. His name was Adrian." John set down his utensils with deliberate care. "This is not a topic for discussion, Lucy. Ever." The pain in his voice was raw, real. The first genuine emotion she'd heard from him since their arrangement began. Lucy reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of touching his hand. "Sometimes sharing the burden makes it lighter," she offered quietly. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the mask slipped completely. She saw years of guilt, grief, and something else, a desperate loneliness that matched her own. Then, like a steel door slamming shut, his walls went back up. "The burden is mine to carry," he said firmly, rising from the table. "Good night, Lucy." She watched him walk away, his shoulders rigid with tension. For the first time since their arrangement began, Lucy saw beyond the powerful businessman to the wounded man beneath. The revelation left her unsettled, challenging her carefully constructed plans to keep her heart uninvolved. In her room that night, Lucy stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of waves. She had entered this marriage believing John was simply a cold, calculating businessman. Now she understood that his emotional walls weren't just for show. They were fortresses built from pain and loss, protecting wounds that had never properly healed. The question was, what would happen to their carefully arranged agreement if those walls began to crumble? And more importantly, was she ready to face the consequences if they did? The Alpha Him penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek Manhattan high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Central Park. Lucy stood in what was now her closet, larger than her old apartment's bedroom, surrounded by designer clothes she hadn't chosen. Each item had been carefully selected to befit her new role as John's wife. Mrs. Alpha Him, Rebecca, her newly appointed personal assistant, appeared in the doorway. "The car will be here in 30 minutes to take you to the hospital." Lucy nodded, selecting a conservative navy dress that would be appropriate for both the hospital and the board member lunch that would follow. "Thank you, Rebecca. Has John already left?" "Mr. Alpha Him left for the office at 5 this morning. He asked me to remind you about tonight's dinner at Le Berard." Of course he had. Their first public appearance as a married couple in Manhattan needed to be perfect. Lucy smoothed the dress over her hips, checking her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at her looked polished, sophisticated, every inch the corporate wife she was supposed to be. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of Manhattan traffic and nervous anticipation. When Lucy entered her mother's room, she found Claire sitting up in bed, looking stronger than she had in months. "Look at you," her mother smiled, reaching for her hand, "all dressed up like a real socialite." "Mom?" Lucy leaned down to hug her, careful of the IV lines. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in ages. This new treatment..." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe we're actually here, that this is happening." Lucy squeezed her mother's hand, pushing down the guilt that threatened to surface. "The doctors are optimistic. Dr. Patterson says your numbers are already improving, thanks to your husband." Claire studied her daughter's face carefully. "How are things with John? Really?" Before Lucy could answer, a knock at the door announced Dr. Patterson's arrival. The next hour was filled with medical discussions, treatment plans, and cautious optimism. Through it all, Lucy maintained her composure, taking notes and asking appropriate questions, just as she knew John would expect. It wasn't until she was back in the car, heading toward the restaurant where she would meet John's board members, that she allowed herself to process her mother's question. How were things with John? After their conversation about his brother, he had retreated further behind his walls, their interactions limited to brief discussions about schedules and appearances. Le Berard's private dining room buzzed with quiet conversation when Lucy arrived. She spotted John immediately, standing with a group of older men in expensive suits. His eyes met hers across the room, and he extended his hand in a perfectly choreographed gesture of welcome. "Darling," he said smoothly, drawing her to his side. "How is Claire doing?" "The doctors are very positive," she replied, letting him guide her through introductions to the board members and their wives. John's hand remained at the small of her back, a possessive touch that was part of their performance. Mrs. Al-Fahim, one of the older board members, Richard Maxwell, addressed her. "We were just discussing the upcoming charity gala. I trust you'll be taking the lead on that, as is traditional for the CEO's wife?" Lucy felt John tense slightly beside her. They hadn't discussed this particular responsibility. "Actually," she began, but John interrupted smoothly. "Lucy's primary focus right now is her mother's recovery. However, I'm sure she'll be happy to consult with the event planning team." "Nonsense," Richard's wife Barbara interjected. "The gala has always been the CEO wife's responsibility. It's how things are done." Lucy felt the weight of expectations settle around her shoulders. This was a test, she realized. Her response would set the tone for her acceptance into their world. "I would be honored to chair the gala committee," she said, feeling John's fingers press slightly harder against her back. "Perhaps, Barbara, you'd be willing to share your expertise from previous years?" The older woman preened, and Lucy saw several of the board members nod approvingly. She had passed their first test, but John's tension told her they would be discussing this later. Throughout dinner, Lucy navigated the complex social dynamics with careful precision. She shared appropriate anecdotes, laughed at the right moments, and deflected personal questions with practiced ease. All the while, she felt John watching her, his dark eyes unreadable. The car ride home was silent, until they entered the private elevator to their penthouse. As soon as the doors closed, John turned to her. "You shouldn't have agreed to chair the gala." "I didn't have much choice," Lucy replied, stepping out of her heels. "You heard Barbara. It's tradition. Traditions can be changed. You already have enough to deal with your mother's treatment and adjusting to our arrangement." Lucy studied him, noting the slight crease between his brows that betrayed his concern. "Are you worried I'll embarrass you?" "No," his answer came quickly, surprising them both. "I'm worried you're taking on too much to maintain appearances." "Isn't that exactly what you hired me for?" The words came out sharper than she intended. John's expression hardened. "I didn't hire you, Lucy. We made an arrangement." "An arrangement that requires me to play the perfect wife," she reminded him. "That includes chairing galas and smiling at board members' wives who judge everything from my shoes to my table manners." "You did more than smile tonight," he observed, following her into the living room. "You managed to charm every person in that room, even Richard Maxwell, and he hasn't approved of anything in 20 years. Lucy turned to face him, surprised by the almost admiring tone in his voice. "Would you rather I hadn't?" "I'd rather you didn't exhaust yourself trying to exceed expectations that don't matter." "They matter to you," she countered. "Everything about appearances matters to you." John stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "What matters to me is maintaining our arrangement without complications. Taking on the gala creates unnecessary pressure." "Is that concern I hear, Mr. Al-Fahim?" Lucy tilted her head, a challenging smile playing at her lips. His eyes darkened. "Professional courtesy, nothing more." "Of course," she murmured. "Heaven forbid you actually care about your fake wife's well-being." Something flickered in his expression. Frustration, perhaps, or something deeper. He reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek in an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. "You're not fake, Lucy," he said softly. "That's what worries me." Before she could process his words, he dropped his hand and stepped back, his walls slamming back into place. "Good night. I have an early meeting tomorrow." Lucy watched him stride away, her cheek tingling where he had touched her. For a moment, she had glimpsed something real beneath his careful control, something that threatened the delicate balance of their arrangement. Later that night, as she lay in her luxurious bedroom, Lucy realized the danger wasn't in failing to meet expectations or managing too many responsibilities. The real danger lay in those brief moments when the lines between performance and reality blurred, when John's mask slipped and she saw the man beneath. Because despite her best intentions, despite the contract that bound them, she was beginning to wonder if her heart was as safe from him as she had promised. Lucy sat in Dr. Morrison's office at Memorial Sloan Kettering, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she absorbed the doctor's words. Her mother's latest test results showed the treatment was working better than expected. A miracle, according to the oncologist. The tumor has reduced by 30%, Dr. Morrison explained, pointing to the scan results. At this rate, we might be looking at complete remission within 6 months. Relief flooded through Lucy's body, making her fingers tremble as she reached for the medical report. All the sacrifices, the carefully maintained facade, the marriage of convenience, it was all worth it for this moment. "Does this mean we can reduce her treatment schedule?" Lucy asked, already thinking about how to tell her mother the good news. "Let's maintain the current protocol for now," Dr. Morrison advised. "But yes, if this trend continues, we can discuss scaling back by the end of the quarter." As Lucy left the hospital, her phone buzzed with a message from John. "Board meeting running late, won't make dinner. Thomas will help with the gala preparations." 3 weeks had passed since the dinner at Le Berard, and John had grown increasingly distant. Their interactions were limited to brief exchanges about schedules and public appearances, each conversation carefully structured to maintain professional distance. The town car waited at the curb, Thomas standing by the open door with his ever-present tablet. "Mrs. Alfahim, I've arranged meetings with 3 potential event planners for the gala. The first appointment is in 30 minutes at the plaza." Lucy nodded, sliding into the car's leather interior. "Thank you, Thomas. Any word on the guest list approval?" "Mr. Alfahim reviewed it this morning. He's added several names and made some adjustments." Something in Thomas's tone made Lucy look up from her phone. "What kind of adjustments?" "He's requested that the Richardson family be removed from the list." Lucy frowned. The Richardsons were major donors to the hospital's cancer research program, exactly the kind of supporters they needed for the gala's fundraising goals. "Did he give a reason?" "No, ma'am." Thomas's expression remained carefully neutral. "But I noticed he also cleared his schedule for the week the Richardsons will be in town for their annual visit." Another piece of the puzzle that was John Alfahim. Lucy filed the information away, adding it to the growing list of mysteries surrounding her husband. The meeting with the event planners proved productive, but Lucy's mind kept wandering to John's strange behavior. By the time she returned to the penthouse that evening, she had made a decision. It was time to do some research of her own. In the home office she rarely used, Lucy opened her laptop and began searching news archives. She cross-referenced the Richardson family with Alfahim Industries, looking for any connection that might explain John's reaction. After 2 hours of searching, she found it, a small article from 12 years ago buried in the society pages. "Rising star, Adrian Alfahim, engaged to Richardson heiress." The photo showed a younger, happier version of John, standing next to a handsome man who could only be his brother, and a beautiful young woman identified as Catherine Richardson. Lucy's heart raced as she dug deeper. 3 months after the engagement announcement, another headline: "Tragedy strikes Alfahim family. Young heir dies in boating accident." The article was brief, mentioning only that Adrian Alfahim had drowned during a weekend trip to the Richardson family's lake house. "Find anything interesting?" Lucy jumped at John's voice. She hadn't heard him enter the office. He stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, jacket gone, a rare glimpse of the man beneath the perfect exterior. "I'm sorry," she began, but he cut her off. "Don't be. You were bound to discover it eventually." He crossed the room to pour himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. "Though I admit, I didn't expect you to be quite so thorough in your investigation." "The Richardsons," Lucy said carefully, watching his reaction. They were going to be your family. John took a long sip of his scotch. Catherine was Adrian's fiancée. They were to be married in the spring. What happened? Official report says Adrian had too much to drink. Took the boat out alone at night. His voice was controlled, but Lucy could hear the pain beneath the surface. The unofficial story is that he and Catherine had a fight. She claimed he was acting erratically, making accusations about her father's business practices. You don't believe it was an accident? John's laugh was bitter. Adrian was an Olympic-level swimmer. He never drank when he was near the water, a personal rule he never broke. And 2 weeks before his death, he told me he discovered something about Richardson Industries, something that could destroy them. Did you investigate? For 3 years. He finished his drink, setting the glass down with careful precision. Every lead went nowhere. Every witness changed their story. Eventually, my father ordered me to drop it, said it was bad for business, that we needed to maintain relationships. Lucy stood, moving closer to him. Is that why you became so focused on control? On maintaining the perfect image? His eyes met hers, dark with remembered pain. I learned that appearances matter more than truth in our world, that power comes from controlling the narrative. And emotions make you vulnerable, she added softly, understanding dawning. Yes. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, the gesture gentle, at odds with his next words. Which is why this, whatever is happening between us, needs to stop. Lucy caught his hand before he could withdraw it. What if I don't want it to stop? For a moment, the mask cracked completely. Lucy saw longing, fear, and something else in his eyes, something that made her heart race. Then he pulled away, rebuilding his walls brick by brick. What we want is irrelevant. We have an arrangement, Lucy. Anything more would be complicated. Life is complicated, she countered. Pretending not to feel anything doesn't make the feelings go away. No, he agreed, moving toward the door, but it keeps them from destroying everything we've built. After he left, Lucy stared at the newspaper article still open on her laptop. The young man in the photo smiled at the camera, his arm around his brother, both of them unaware of the tragedy to come. She understood now why John had buried himself in control and obligation. He had lost not only his brother but his faith in love, in vulnerability, in the possibility of happiness that couldn't be taken away. The question was, could she reach the man beneath the carefully constructed facade? And more importantly, was she willing to risk her own heart in the attempt? As she got ready for bed that night, Lucy's phone buzzed with a text from John. I've reconsidered. Add the Richardsons to the guest list. Some ghosts need to be faced. She stared at the message, understanding the cost of that decision. Whatever happened next would change everything for both of them. The Metropolitan Museum's Great Hall buzzed with activity as event planners and decorators transformed the space for the upcoming gala. Lucy stood at the center of the controlled chaos, reviewing seating arrangements with Barbara Maxwell while trying to ignore the growing tension headache behind her eyes. The Richardsons must be seated at table 1, Barbara insisted, tapping the chart with her perfectly manicured nail. They're major donors, and Catherine's father chairs the hospital board. I understand, Lucy replied diplomatically, but John specifically requested they be seated at table 3 with the hospital administrators. Barbara's eyes narrowed. There's history there, isn't there? Between John and Catherine? Before Lucy could respond, a familiar voice cut through the noise. The seating arrangements stay as they are. John approached, impeccable in a charcoal suit despite the early hour, his presence immediately commanding attention, staff and planners straightening unconsciously as he passed. John, darling, Barbara smiled, all honeyed venom. I was just explaining to your lovely wife about certain social protocols, which my wife understands perfectly, he interrupted smoothly. If you'll excuse us, Barbara, I need to discuss something with Lucy. He guided Lucy away from the group, his hand at the small of her back sending warmth through her body, despite the professional distance he maintained. You didn't have to rescue me, she murmured, once they were out of earshot. I wasn't rescuing you. I was preventing Barbara from mining for gossip about Adrian. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. She's been trying to uncover that story for years. Lucy studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. Are you sure about having the Richardsons here? We could find another major donor. It's time, he cut her off. Besides, your mother's treatment results prove the research program works. We need their continued support. The mention of her mother brought a smile to Lucy's face. The latest scan showed even more improvement. Dr. Morrison thinks... She broke off as John suddenly pulled her behind one of the massive columns, his body shielding her from view. Before she could question his actions, she heard voices approaching. I still think this is a mistake, Catherine. After what happened with Adrian, it's been 12 years, Mother. I've moved on. Besides, I'm married now. Surely John has gotten over his ridiculous suspicions. The voices passed their hiding spot, and Lucy caught a glimpse of an elegant blonde woman and her older companion walking toward the entrance. Catherine Richardson radiated old money confidence, her designer outfit and perfect posture speaking of a lifetime of privilege. John's hands were still on Lucy's shoulders, his breath warm against her hair. They stood frozen until the clicking of heels faded away. Well, Lucy said softly, that was dramatic. John stepped back as if burned, straightening his tie. I apologize. I didn't expect them to be here today. Clearly. She smoothed her dress, trying to ignore the lingering warmth where his hands had been. Want to tell me what she meant about your ridiculous suspicions? His expression hardened. Not here. Then where, John? Frustration colored her voice. You can't keep shutting me out, especially not with the gala coming up. I need to know what I'm walking into. He studied her for a long moment, the internal war visible in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. Tonight, after dinner. The rest of the day passed in a blur of decisions about flowers, lighting, and menu selections. Lucy threw herself into the details, trying not to think about Catherine's perfectly polished presence, or the way John had instinctively protected her from that encounter. When she arrived home that evening, she found John in his study, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up as he reviewed documents on his laptop. A half-empty glass of scotch sat beside him. There's dinner in the warming drawer, he said without looking up. I'm not hungry. Lucy closed his laptop gently. Talk to me. John leaned back, running a hand through his usually perfect hair. What do you want to know? Everything. Starting with why Catherine's mother thinks you had ridiculous suspicions. He was quiet for so long that Lucy thought he might not answer. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal. This was Adrian's, he explained, handling it carefully. I found it in his office after everything. Most of it is normal business notes, but... He opened to a marked page and handed it to her. Lucy read carefully, her eyes widening at the detailed notes about suspicious transfers between Richardson Industries and offshore accounts, mentions of clinical trial data being manipulated, and finally, a single line that made her blood run cold. C says she'll help expose everything. Meeting at Lake House this weekend to plan next steps. Adrian was investigating Richardson's pharmaceutical division, John explained, his voice tight with controlled emotion. He discovered they were falsifying trial data to fast-track drug approvals. Catherine initially agreed to help him gather evidence, but something changed. You think she betrayed him? I think she warned her father. John's hands clenched on the armrests of his chair. The night Adrian died, there were 3 calls from Catherine's phone to her father's private line. After the accident, all the evidence Adrian had gathered disappeared. Lucy set the journal down carefully. Did you take this to the authorities? With what proof? A few cryptic journal entries and some phone records? He laughed bitterly. Richardson's lawyers would have buried it in seconds. Besides, by then my father had already arranged to merge our pharmaceutical divisions. The deal was worth billions. So you were forced to work with the people you believed responsible for your brother's death. Welcome to my world, Lucy. He stood, moving to the window. where appearances matter more than truth and justice takes a back seat to profit margins. Lucy approached him slowly, placing a hand on his arm. Is that why you agreed to our arrangement? To maintain appearances? He turned to face her, and the raw pain in his eyes took her breath away. I agreed because you were different, honest, real. You didn't want this life. You were willing to enter it to save someone you loved, just like Adrian. The comparison hung between them, heavy with implication. Lucy's heart raced as John reached up to cup her cheek. But I can't protect you if I let myself feel... He trailed off, his thumb brushing her lip. I don't need protection, she whispered. I need you to trust me. For a moment, the walls crumbled completely. John's eyes darkened with longing, and Lucy felt herself swaying toward him, drawn by the magnetic pull between them. Then his phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He stepped back, checking the message. The Richardsons have officially RSVP'd for the gala, he said, his professional mask sliding back into place. All of them. Lucy straightened, squaring her shoulders. Then we'll face them together. Lucy... He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. Whatever happens at the gala, whatever you hear or see, remember one thing. Not everything is as it appears. What do you mean? Just trust that I have a plan. He moved toward the door, then paused. And Lucy, thank you. For listening, for understanding. After he left, Lucy stared at Adrian's journal, still open on the desk. Something about this whole situation felt off. The convenient timing of the Richardsons' appearance, John's cryptic warning. She had entered this marriage believing she understood the rules. Maintain appearances, play her part, keep her heart safe. But now, with secrets and old wounds threatening to surface, she realized the game was far more dangerous than she'd imagined, and her heart was no longer the only one at risk. The night of the gala arrived with the weight of impending storm clouds. Lucy stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the midnight blue Valentino gown that John's stylist had chosen for the occasion. The dress hugged her curves before flowing into a dramatic train, its deep color making her skin glow. You look beautiful, John's voice came from the doorway. He stood there in his tuxedo, every inch the powerful CEO, but something in his eyes had changed when he looked at her lately. Thank you, Lucy turned to face him, noting the slight tension in his shoulders. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for 12 years. He crossed the room to stand behind her, their eyes meeting in the mirror. But I need to know if you are. For what exactly? She watched as he fastened a stunning diamond necklace around her throat, his fingers lingering on her skin. For what might happen tonight? His voice was low, intimate. Things could get complicated. Lucy turned to face him, close enough to catch the subtle scent of his cologne. You still won't tell me what you're planning? It's safer if you don't know. He adjusted the necklace, his touch sending shivers down her spine. Just follow my lead, and remember what I told you. Not everything is as it appears. The Metropolitan Museum's Great Hall had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over elegant table settings, while strategic spotlighting highlighted the architectural details of the historic space. Lucy's careful planning had paid off. The effect was breathtaking. As they made their entrance, all eyes turned to watch them descend the grand staircase. They played their parts perfectly, the powerful CEO and his elegant wife, untouchable in their success and beauty. But Lucy felt the undercurrent of tension in John's hand at her waist. John, darling! Catherine Richardson's voice cut through the crowd. She approached with practiced grace, her husband Michael trailing behind her. It's been far too long. Lucy felt John's fingers tighten briefly on her hip, before he smoothly turned them to face the approaching couple. Catherine, Michael, thank you for coming. As if we'd miss it. Catherine's smile was perfect, but her eyes were sharp as they assessed Lucy. And this must be your new bride. We were all so surprised when we heard the news. Lucy, she introduced herself, extending her hand with calculated warmth. I'm so pleased you could join us. Your family's support of the hospital's research program is remarkable. Yes. Well, medical research has always been close to our hearts. Catherine's gaze flickered to John. Hasn't it, darling? Before he could respond, Thomas appeared at John's elbow. Mr. Alfahim, there's a situation that requires your immediate attention. If you'll excuse me, John said smoothly, but not before giving Lucy's hand a subtle squeeze. Lucy, why don't you tell Catherine about the new treatment protocols we're funding? As he walked away with Thomas, Lucy found herself alone with Catherine and her quietly hovering husband. The blonde woman's perfect smile never wavered. New wife, new charity focus, Catherine mused, sipping her champagne. One might think John was trying to rewrite history. Or perhaps he's trying to create something positive from tragedy, Lucy countered, keeping her voice gentle but firm. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. So he's told you about Adrian? I wondered if he would. He told me enough. Did he tell you about his obsession? How he nearly destroyed both our families with his accusations? Catherine stepped closer, lowering her voice. Did he tell you what really happened that night? Catherine. Michael's warning tone suggested this was a familiar conversation, but Catherine wasn't finished. Ask him about the file he received the day before Adrian died. Ask him why he didn't come to the lake house that weekend when he was supposed to. Mrs. Richardson, Lucy interrupted quietly. I understand you've been carrying this pain for a long time, but whatever happened 12 years ago, throwing accusations at a public event won't help anyone. Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. You're different from what I expected. Less decorative. I'm full of surprises, Lucy smiled, excusing herself as she spotted her mother being wheeled in by Daniel. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Lucy kept one eye on John, who seemed to be engaged in intense conversations with various board members. Whatever his plan was, it appeared to be in motion. It wasn't until dinner was served that she noticed something odd. The Richardsons were seated at their assigned table, but they weren't alone. Two men in expensive suits had joined them, men Lucy recognized from news coverage of recent corporate fraud investigations. John appeared at her side as if conjured by her thoughts. Dance with me, he murmured, leading her to the dance floor as the orchestra began a waltz. What's happening? She asked, as they moved together with practiced ease. In about 10 minutes, federal agents will enter this room with warrants for Robert Richardson and several members of his board. John's voice was barely a whisper against her ear. 12 years of patience is about to pay off. Lucy's heart raced. The evidence from Adrian's investigation was never lost, just carefully preserved and supplemented over the years. His hand tightened on her waist. Adrian wasn't the only one investigating Richardson Industries. He was just the one they discovered. Understanding dawned. You've been building a case all this time? With help from some very patient federal prosecutors, John's eyes met hers, burning with intensity. Catherine was right about one thing. I did receive a file the day before Adrian died. It was proof that Richardson's people had discovered Adrian's investigation. I stayed away from the lake house that weekend because I was meeting with federal agents, trying to protect him. I just wasn't fast enough. Lucy's throat tightened at the pain in his voice. It wasn't your fault. No, he agreed softly. It was theirs, and tonight they'll finally face consequences. As if on cue, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Men in dark suits entered the hall, their FBI jackets stark against the elegant evening wear of the crowd. Lucy watched as Robert Richardson's face drained of color while Catherine stood frozen, champagne glass slipping from her fingers to shatter on the marble floor. Mr. Richardson, the lead agent's voice carried across the suddenly silent room. We have a warrant for your arrest. Chaos erupted. Guests gasped and whispered as Richardson was led away in handcuffs, his wife sobbing dramatically, while Catherine stood in shocked silence. Through it all, John held Lucy close, still moving slowly to music only they seemed to hear. Why didn't you tell me? She asked finally. I needed your reactions to be genuine. The Richardsons have been watching us, looking for any sign of what was coming. His thumb stroked her cheek gently. You were perfect, exactly what they expected to see. The beautiful, naive wife too new to know about old scandals. "I'm not naive," she reminded him. "No," he agreed, his eyes softening. "You're extraordinary." Before she could respond, Thomas appeared again. "Sir, the press is outside. They'll want a statement." John nodded but didn't release Lucy. "Tell them we'll be out in 5 minutes. And Thomas, make sure Mrs. Alfahim's mother and brother get home safely." As Thomas hurried away, John turned back to Lucy. "Ready to face the cameras together?" she asked, searching his eyes. His answer was to lean down and kiss her right there in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by shocked whispers and camera flashes. It wasn't part of their performance, wasn't calculated or controlled. It was real, and powerful, and terrifying in its implications. When he finally pulled back, his eyes held a mixture of triumph and vulnerability that took her breath away. "Together," he confirmed, as they walked toward the press conference that would change everything. Lucy realized their carefully constructed arrangement had crumbled. In its place, something new and fragile was growing, something neither of them had planned for, but both might have secretly wanted all along. Dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold as Lucy stood at the penthouse windows, still wearing her evening gown from the gala. The past 12 hours felt surreal. The arrests, the press conference, the endless questions from reporters eager to connect the dots between Adrian's death and Richardson's downfall. "You should get some rest," John's voice came from behind her. He had loosened his bow tie and rolled up his sleeves, his usual perfect appearance slightly disheveled in a way that made him look more human. "I'm not sure I could sleep," she admitted, turning to face him. "My mind keeps racing." The look on Catherine's face when they arrested her father. She knew. John moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Maybe not everything, but she knew enough. The investigators found emails proving she warned her father about Adrian's investigation. Lucy studied his profile in the early morning light. "How do you feel? After all these years of waiting, planning?" "Hollow," he answered, surprising them both with his honesty. "I thought bringing them to justice would feel different, more satisfying, complete." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of emotional vulnerability. "But it doesn't bring Adrian back. It doesn't change the fact that I failed to protect him." Without thinking, Lucy reached for his hand. "You didn't fail him, John. You spent 12 years making sure his death wasn't in vain." His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and strong. "The hospital board is meeting this afternoon to discuss contingency plans. Richardson's arrest will affect the research funding. We'll find other donors," Lucy said firmly. "My mother's case proves the treatment works. We can use that to attract new supporters." John turned to face her fully, their joined hands between them. "We?" he quoted softly. "Yes, we." She met his gaze steadily. "Unless you're planning to maintain our professional distance now that the Richardson threat is neutralized." Something shifted in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or hope. "Would you want that? To go back to our original arrangement?" Instead of answering, he reached up with his free hand to cup her cheek. "I think we both know our arrangement stopped being purely professional weeks ago." "When?" she asked, leaning slightly into his touch. "That first morning in the Hamptons," he admitted. "When you asked me what I wanted from life, no one had asked me that in years." His thumb traced her cheekbone gently. "When did it change for you?" "When you showed me Adrian's journal. You trusted me with your pain, your vulnerability. That's when I realized you were more than the mask you wear." Their faces had drawn closer as they spoke, the magnetic pull between them nearly impossible to resist. Just as John began to lean in, his phone buzzed insistently. "The board," he sighed, checking the message. "They've moved the meeting up. They're waiting for us." "Us?" "You're my wife," he said simply, "and after last night's performance, they'll expect us to present a united front." Lucy stepped back, smoothing her rumpled gown. "I should change. I doubt last night's evening wear is appropriate for a morning board meeting." "Lucy!" John caught her arm as she turned to go. "We need to talk about this. About us. About what happens next." "I know," she offered him a small smile. "But right now we have a hospital to save, and a legacy to protect. The rest can wait." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll have Thomas bring the files to your room. Take 30 minutes to change and review them." As Lucy hurried to make herself presentable, she could feel the shift in their dynamic. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, replaced by something both thrilling and terrifying in its potential. The board meeting proved intense but productive. Lucy sat beside John as he outlined plans to stabilize the hospital's funding, her occasional inputs demonstrating their synchronicity as a team. The board members, initially skeptical of her presence, began to defer to her judgment on matters related to the research program. It wasn't until they were leaving the hospital that Lucy noticed something was wrong. John's usual confident stride had slowed, and a slight sheen of sweat gleamed on his forehead. "Are you all right?" she asked, touching his arm in concern. "Just tired," he assured her, but his voice sounded strained. "It's been a long 24 hours. Before she could question him further, he stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wall. His face had gone alarmingly pale. "John!" Lucy moved to support him, feeling the heat radiating from his body. "You're burning up." "I'm fine," he insisted, but his legs seemed to give way. "Just need to—" He didn't finish the sentence before collapsing, Lucy barely managing to break his fall. Her shouts for help brought hospital staff running, and within minutes, John was being rushed to the emergency department. "Severe exhaustion and dehydration," the doctor explained later, after they'd stabilized him, "combined with what appears to be a nasty case of flu. Has he been under unusual stress lately?" Lucy almost laughed at the question. "You could say that. He needs rest, real rest, not just a few hours between meetings." The doctor gave her a knowing look. "I'm prescribing at least 3 days of home recovery. No work, no phones, no stress." Sitting beside John's hospital bed, watching his chest rise and fall with steady breaths, Lucy felt a surge of protective determination. He had spent years taking care of everyone else: his father's company, his brother's memory, her family's needs. Now it was her turn to take care of him. When his eyes finally fluttered open, they focused immediately on her face. "The board meeting is handled," she interrupted firmly. "Thomas has rescheduled everything for next week. Right now you're under strict orders to rest." "I don't have time to rest," he protested weakly. "The press will be watching, waiting for signs of weakness." "Let them watch." Lucy took his hand, noting how his fingers automatically intertwined with hers. "They'll see exactly what we want them to see. A devoted wife taking care of her husband after he orchestrated one of the biggest corporate fraud exposures in recent history. It's perfect for our image." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Still thinking about appearances?" "No," she said softly. "I'm thinking about the man I'm falling in love with, and how I'm not ready to lose him to his own stubborn pride." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. John's eyes widened slightly, his hand tightening on hers. "Lucy," he began, his voice rough with emotion, but she placed a finger against his lips. "Rest first," she insisted gently. "We'll talk about everything else when you're stronger." As she watched him drift back to sleep, Lucy realized their carefully constructed arrangement had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. Something real, vulnerable, and infinitely more precious than any contract could capture. The morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows as Lucy arranged a breakfast tray, carefully selecting items that would tempt John's diminished appetite. After 3 days of enforced rest, he was growing restless, but his body was still fighting the combination of flu and exhaustion that had landed him in the hospital. "If you're planning to force-feed me more soup, I may have to file for divorce." John's voice came from the doorway of the kitchen. He stood there in silk pajama pants and a t-shirt, looking impossibly handsome despite his pallor. "Back to bed," Lucy ordered, trying to ignore how the casual attire made him seem more accessible, more real. "Doctor's orders." "I've been in bed for 3 days," He moved to the kitchen island, settling onto a stool with careful movements that betrayed his lingering weakness. "I need to check on the Richardson situation. The press has been handled," she interrupted, sliding a cup of ginger tea toward him. "Thomas and I have been managing everything. The story is exactly what we want it to be. The dedicated CEO taking a brief rest after exposing a major corporate scandal." John wrapped his hands around the warm cup, studying her over its rim. "You've been remarkable through all of this." "I'm just fulfilling our arrangement," she said lightly, but they both knew it wasn't true anymore. "About that," he sat down the cup, his eyes serious. "They what you said at the hospital?" Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped her declaration of falling in love might be forgotten in his fever-induced haze. "You were sick. You needed to rest. I would have said anything to make that happen." "Liar." His voice was soft, almost tender. "You're many things, Lucy, but you've never been a good liar." Before she could respond, the elevator chimed, announcing a visitor. Moments later, Claire appeared in her wheelchair, pushed by Daniel. "Mom?" Lucy moved to embrace her mother, grateful for the interruption. "I thought your treatment wasn't until tomorrow." "It's not," Claire smiled, her color notably better than it had been weeks ago. "But when I heard John was ill, I insisted on coming to check on my son-in-law." Something warm bloomed in Lucy's chest at the way John straightened, clearly touched by her mother's concern. "Mrs. Morrison, you shouldn't have troubled yourself." "Claire," her mother corrected firmly. "And it's no trouble. Family takes care of family." The word family seemed to hang in the air, loaded with meaning. John's expression softened in a way Lucy had never seen before. "Daniel," he addressed her brother, who had been hovering uncertainly near the door. "Would you mind helping me with something in my office? There are some documents I've been meaning to discuss with you." As the men left, Claire turned to her daughter with knowing eyes. "So, when were you planning to tell me?" "Tell you what?" "That this arranged marriage of yours isn't so arranged anymore." Lucy busied herself with cleaning up the breakfast preparations. "Mom, it's complicated." "Love usually is," Claire said simply. "But I see the way you look at each other. It's the same way your father used to look at me." "We had an agreement," Lucy sighed, finally facing her mother. "Keep things professional. Maintain appearances, help each other achieve our goals. Feelings weren't supposed to be part of the equation." "Sweetheart, feelings are always part of the equation. You can't control the heart, no matter how many contracts you sign." In John's office, a similar conversation was taking place. "These aren't actually documents," Daniel observed, looking at the blank papers John had pulled out. "No," John admitted, sinking into his chair. "I wanted to ask you something about Lucy." Daniel's protective instincts flared. "If you're planning to hurt her—" "The opposite, actually." John met the younger man's eyes directly. "I need to know if you think she could ever truly be happy with me. Not because of our arrangement, but really happy." Understanding dawned on Daniel's face. "You love her." It wasn't a question, but John answered anyway. "More than I thought possible. More than I deserve." "Have you told her?" "How can I?" John ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I trapped her in this marriage with a contract. I used her mother's illness as leverage. What kind of foundation is that for real love?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering. "You know, before all this happened, Lucy was always the strong one, taking care of Mom, helping me with school, never asking for anything for herself. But lately she smiles more. She laughs. Even with everything that's happened, she seems lighter." "That's not because of me," John protested. "No?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then why does she light up every time you enter a room? Why does she spend hours reading medical journals so she can understand Mom's treatment better and discuss it with you? Why did she nearly wear a hole in the hospital floor pacing while you were sick?" Before John could respond, they heard movement in the hallway. Lucy appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. "Everything okay in here?" "Perfect," Daniel smiled, standing. "Just having a chat with my brother-in-law." When they returned to the kitchen, Claire was ready to leave. "Remember what I said," she told Lucy, squeezing her hand. Then, to everyone's surprise, she reached for John's hand as well. "And you take care of yourself. Doctor's orders." After they left, silence fell over the penthouse. Lucy could feel John watching her as she moved around the kitchen, putting away the breakfast things she'd abandoned earlier. "Your mother is remarkable," he said finally. "She is." Lucy turned to face him. "She thinks we're in love." John's breath caught audibly. "And what do you think?" "I think." Lucy moved closer, her heart pounding. "I think I'm tired of pretending, of maintaining appearances, of acting like I don't feel what I feel." He stood, closing the distance between them. "And what do you feel?" "You know what I feel. I told you in the hospital." His hands came up to frame her face, gentle but trembling slightly. "Tell me again, please." Lucy looked into his eyes, seeing all the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "I'm falling in love with you, John. Actually, that's not true." She took a deep breath. "I've already fallen, completely, terrifyingly in love with you." For a moment he just stared at her, his thumb stroking her cheeks. Then slowly, deliberately, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. Unlike their kiss at the gala, this one was soft, tender, filled with all the words they hadn't been able to say. When they finally parted, John rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been fighting it, trying to protect you, to protect myself, but I can't fight it anymore. I love you, Lucy." She smiled through the tears that had somehow formed in her eyes. "So what do we do now?" "Now," he said, pulling her closer. "We tear up that contract and start over. No arrangements, no appearances to maintain. Just us, building something real together." Together, as they stood in their kitchen, wrapped in each other's arms, Lucy realized that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected beginnings. Their arrangement had started as a business deal, but it had grown into something far more precious, a love story written in their own unique way. The September morning dawned bright and crisp as Lucy sat in her doctor's waiting room, her fingers nervously twisting the wedding ring that now meant so much more than a business arrangement. She'd been feeling off for weeks, dizzy spells, unexpected fatigue, and a peculiar sensitivity to smells that made even her favorite coffee suddenly repulsive. "Mrs. Al-Fahim," the nurse called, leading her to an examination room. 20 minutes later, Lucy stared at Dr. Chen in shock. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "You're pregnant," the doctor smiled warmly. "About 8 weeks along, and based on the ultrasound, congratulations, you're having twins." Twins. The word echoed in Lucy's mind as she left the medical building, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. She and John hadn't discussed children. Their relationship had only recently transformed from arrangement to reality. How would he react to this unexpected development? Her phone buzzed with a message from John. "Meeting finished early. Join me for lunch?" Their usual cafe was quiet when she arrived. John stood to greet her, pulling her close for a kiss that still made her heart race. 2 months of real relationship had softened his public persona, though he maintained his professional demeanor in business settings. "You look pale," he observed as they sat. "Are you feeling all right?" Lucy took a deep breath. "We need to talk." His expression immediately grew concerned. "What's wrong? Is it your mother's treatment?" "No, Mom's doing great. The latest scans show she's almost in complete remission." Lucy reached for his hand across the table. "This is about us, about our future." "Lucy, you're scaring me." "I'm pregnant," she said quickly before she could lose her nerve. "With twins." John went completely still, his face unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Please say something," she whispered. He blinked, seeming to come back to himself. "Twins." His voice cracked slightly on the word. "Yes, I just found out. I know we haven't discussed children, and this wasn't planned. Marry me." Lucy stared at him. "We're already married." "No," John moved his chair closer, taking both her hands in his. Marry me for real, not because of a contract or appearances or business arrangements. Marry me because I love you, because we're having twins, because I want to spend the rest of my life building a family with you. John, I mean it. His eyes were intense, filled with emotion. Let's have a real wedding. Small, intimate, just family and close friends. No press, no business obligations. Just us making real vows based on love. Tears spilled down Lucy's cheeks. You really want this? The babies, a new wedding, all of it? More than I've ever wanted anything. He reached up to wipe away her tears. You've given me back my heart, Lucy. Now you're giving me a family. I never thought I could have this kind of happiness. Their moment was interrupted by John's phone buzzing insistently. He glanced at it and froze. What is it? My father. John showed her the message. He's flying in from Dubai tonight. He wants to discuss urgent family matters. Lucy's heart sank. Abdul Al-Fahim was a traditionalist who had approved their marriage purely for its business advantage. How would he react to their plans to remarry for love, to the news of the twins? He'll be part of the twins' lives, John said, reading her thoughts. He needs to accept that our marriage is real now, that we're building a real family. And if he doesn't accept it, then that's his loss. John's voice was firm. I've spent my whole life trying to meet his expectations, to be the perfect son after Adrian's death. But I won't sacrifice my happiness, our happiness, anymore. That evening, they waited in John's office at Al-Fahim Tower for his father's arrival. Lucy wore a conservative dress that didn't hint at her condition while John paced nervously by the windows. When Abdul Al-Fahim entered, his presence commanded attention just as his sons did. But where John had learned to soften his edges, Abdul remained sharp, unyielding. Father, John greeted him formally. Welcome back to New York. Save the pleasantries, Abdul said, his accent thick. We need to discuss the Richardson situation. The board is concerned about the publicity. The board approved my handling of the situation, John replied calmly. The press has been positive, and our stock price has actually increased. The board approved because they had no choice. But there are questions about your judgment. Abdul's eyes shifted to Lucy. About your priorities. My priorities are exactly where they should be. With my family. Abdul's eyebrows rose. Family? This arrangement was meant to stabilize the company's image, nothing more. Things have changed. John moved to stand beside Lucy, taking her hand. We've changed. We're in love, Lucy added quietly. And we're having twins. The silence that followed was deafening. Abdul stared at them, his expression darkening. This is unacceptable. A romantic entanglement will complicate everything. And children? Now, when the company needs your full attention. The company has my attention. John's voice was steel wrapped in silk. But it no longer has my soul. I lost Adrian because I put business before family. I won't make that mistake again. You dare mention Adrian? Abdul's face flushed with anger. After you failed to protect him. No, father. You failed to protect him. You chose business deals over justice. You made me do the same for 12 years. John's grip on Lucy's hand tightened. But not anymore. Lucy and our children come first. The company will benefit from having a CEO who remembers how to be human. Abdul turned to Lucy, his eyes cold. You think you can give him what he needs? Understanding of our world, our obligations? I think I already have. She met his gaze steadily. I've given him permission to be himself, to feel, to love. And soon I'll give him children who will know their father as a man of heart, not just duty. Something flickered in Abdul's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant respect. He looked between them, seeing their united front, their intertwined fingers, the protective way John angled his body toward Lucy. You really love her? He asked his son softly. More than life, John answered without hesitation. Abdul was quiet for a long moment. Then, to their surprise, he sank into a chair, suddenly looking older, more vulnerable. Your mother would have liked her, he said finally. She always said you needed someone strong enough to challenge you, brave enough to love you completely. Tears shone in John's eyes at the mention of his mother, who had died when he was young. You never talk about her. Perhaps that was my mistake. One of many. Abdul looked at Lucy. My wife. She was like you, independent, fierce in her love. When we lost her, I forgot how to be anything but a businessman. It's not too late, Lucy said gently, to be more than that. The twins will need their grandfather. A ghost of a smile touched Abdul's lips. Twins, like your mother, John. She was a twin. The tension in the room gradually eased as Abdul began sharing stories about John's mother, about his own journey from young love to hardened businessman. It wasn't perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Later that night, lying in bed with John's hand resting protectively over her stomach, Lucy reflected on how life had changed. Their carefully arranged marriage had evolved into something neither of them had expected, a love story strong enough to heal old wounds and build new bridges. What are you thinking about? John murmured against her hair. About how sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't plan for. He pulled her closer, his voice thick with emotion. I love you. All three of you. The private garden of the Alfahim estate in the Hamptons bloomed with late October roses as Lucy walked its paths, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. In 3 days, she and John would exchange vows again, this time for love, not duty. The flowers will need to be moved if it rains, Barbara Maxwell fretted, following Lucy with a clipboard. The older woman had surprisingly offered to help with the intimate ceremony, perhaps making amends for her earlier judgment. The forecast is clear, Lucy assured her, pausing to catch her breath. At 12 weeks pregnant with twins, she found herself tiring more easily. You should be resting, Claire called from her spot on the terrace where she was arranging place cards for the small reception. Her recovery had progressed remarkably, allowing her to take an active role in the wedding preparations. I'm fine, Mom, but Lucy accepted the chair Daniel pulled out for her, grateful for the support of both her families, old and new. Mrs. Alfahim, Thomas appeared with his tablet. Mr. Alfahim asked me to show you something. The screen displayed a real estate listing, a beautiful brownstone in the Upper East Side, close to both their families and Central Park. He thinks it might be better for the babies than the penthouse, Thomas explained. More space, a real yard. Tears welled in Lucy's eyes at this evidence of John's thoughtfulness. Her hormones had been making her emotional lately, something that both amused and concerned her husband. Speaking of my son, Abdul's voice carried from the doorway. Where is he hiding? Conference call with Tokyo, Thomas replied. He should be finished soon. Abdul settled into a chair near Lucy, his formal demeanor softening as it often did now when family was involved. How are my grandchildren today? Active, Lucy smiled. Placing a hand on her belly, the doctor says they're developing perfectly. Strong, like their parents. Abdul's eyes held a warmth that would have seemed impossible months ago. John told me you've decided to wait to learn their genders? We want to be surprised, though your son is convinced they're girls. A father's intuition is often wrong. When my wife was pregnant with John, I was certain he was a daughter. Abdul's expression grew distant with memory. She laughed at me for months. The mention of John's mother no longer brought pain, but fond remembrance. Since that night in the office, Abdul had begun sharing more stories about her, helping John reconnect with memories he'd buried, along with his grief for Adrian. There you all are, John's voice drew their attention. He crossed the terrace to kiss Lucy softly, then nodded respectfully to his father. Tokyo is satisfied with the new arrangements. We can focus on more important things now. Like deciding on this house? Lucy held up Thomas's tablet. John's eyes lit up. You saw it? What do you think? The nursery would get morning sun, and there's a small garden where the children could play. It's perfect, she interrupted his eager planning. But are you sure about leaving the penthouse? The penthouse was for appearances, he said simply. This is for our family. The way he said family with such joy and certainty made Lucy's heart swell. She reached for his hand, needing to touch him, to ground herself in the reality of their happiness. "Well," Barbara cleared her throat, clearly affected by the moment despite herself. "We should review the final arrangements for Sunday. The ceremony will begin at sunset." As she detailed the plans they'd already discussed multiple times, Lucy found herself studying John. He sat beside her, occasionally adding a comment or suggestion, but his thumb never stopped its gentle caress of her knuckles. How far they'd come from that first clinical meeting in his office. Later that evening, after their families had departed and the wedding planners had finally run out of details to discuss, Lucy found John in Adrian's old room. They'd converted it into a sitting room, keeping some of his photos and mementos, but transforming the space from a shrine to grief into a place of remembrance. He would have loved being an uncle, John said without turning, sensing her presence. Adrian always wanted a big family. Lucy wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Tell me about him. Something happy." John's hand covered hers where they rested on his chest. "When I was studying for my business degree, taking everything so seriously, Adrian would kidnap me for impromptu adventures. Once he drove us to Atlantic City in the middle of finals week, just because he decided I needed to remember how to laugh." "Did you?" "We lost $200 at blackjack, ate terrible casino buffet food, and drove back singing horrible karaoke." John chuckled at the memory. "I aced my finals anyway, and Adrian never let me forget that sometimes the best moments in life are the unplanned ones." "Like falling in love with your contract wife?" Lucy teased gently. He turned in her arms, his expression tender. "Exactly like that." His hand drifted to her belly, protective and loving. "Or finding out we're having twins." "Are you nervous? About Sunday?" "About marrying the woman I love who's carrying my children in front of the people who matter most to us." He pretended to consider. "Terrified." Lucy laughed, swatting his chest. "Be serious." "I am serious." He cradled her face in his hands. "I'm terrified of how much I love you, of how complete you've made my life. Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all been a dream." "Not a dream," she assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Just a different kind of arrangement than we planned." "Speaking of arrangements," he stepped back suddenly, looking nervous. "There's something I want to show you." He led her to his study, where a thick envelope lay on his desk. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside, Lucy found their original marriage contract, torn neatly in half. Beneath it was a new document, a deed to the brownstone, listed in both their names. "I know it's not very romantic," John said quickly, "but I wanted you to see everything I have, everything I am. It's yours now. No contracts, no conditions." Tears spilled down Lucy's cheeks as she launched herself into his arms. "I love you, you impossible man, even when you're being terribly corporate about romance." "Especially then?" She smiled through her tears. "Because that's who you are, the perfect blend of businessman and loving husband, and soon, loving father." As if on cue, she felt a flutter in her belly, the first definitive movement of their babies. John's eyes widened as she pressed his hand to the spot. "Was that your daughter saying hello?" she teased. "Or sons, or one of each?" He pulled her closer, his voice thick with emotion. "3 more days until I can marry you properly." "We're already married." "No," he corrected gently. "We were contracted. Now we're choosing each other every day for love." As they stood in his study, their children moving beneath their joined hands, Lucy marveled at how life's greatest gifts often come disguised as business arrangements. The October sunset painted the Hampton sky in shades of gold and rose as Lucy stood before the full-length mirror in what would soon be her and John's new bedroom. Her wedding dress, specially designed to accommodate her growing belly, floated around her in layers of ivory silk. "You look beautiful," Claire said softly, adjusting the simple veil. Her mother's eyes shone with happy tears, her face glowing with health that had seemed impossible just months ago. "We're already married," Lucy reminded her, smoothing the fabric over her stomach where the twins had been particularly active all day. This is everything," her mother corrected. "This is love chosen freely and given completely." A knock at the door revealed Daniel in his best suit. They're ready downstairs, and John is about to wear a hole in the garden path. The intimate gathering waited in the estate's rose garden. Only 30 guests, family, and closest friends, who had supported their journey from arrangement to love. As Lucy descended the terrace steps on Daniel's arm, her eyes found John immediately. He stood beneath an arch of white roses, more handsome than ever in his tuxedo, but it was his expression that took her breath away. Pure love and wonder, as though he were seeing her for the first time. Abdul stood beside his son, his usual stern demeanor softened by evident emotion. Barbara Maxwell dabbed at her eyes while Thomas beamed from his place among the guests. Even John's board members, who had been invited, seemed touched by the obvious love between the couple they'd once viewed as merely a business arrangement. When Lucy reached John, he took her hands in his thumbs brushing her knuckles in that familiar, comforting gesture she'd grown to love dearly. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began, but Lucy barely heard the words. She was lost in John's eyes, in the journey that had brought them here. When it came time for their vows, John spoke first, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion evident in his face. "Lucy, I once offered you a contract, thinking I could control love like I controlled everything else in my life. But you taught me that real love can't be contained in clauses and conditions. You brought light back into my world, helped me remember how to feel, how to trust, how to live fully." He placed a hand on her belly, drawing gasps and smiles from their guests. "You've given me a family, not just our children, but a reason to open my heart again. I promise to love you without conditions, to cherish every moment we create together, and to always remember that the best things in life are the ones we don't plan for." Tears spilled down Lucy's cheeks as she began her own vows. "John, I came to you seeking security, thinking I could keep my heart safe behind walls of practicality. But you showed me that true security comes from being brave enough to love completely. You've given me so much more than I ever dreamed possible: hope, joy, partnership, and a love that grows stronger every day." She squeezed his hands, feeling their babies move as if responding to the moment. "I promise to stand beside you always, to face whatever comes together, and to remind you every day that you are worthy of all the love in the world." As they exchanged rings, new ones chosen together, Lucy noticed Abdul wiping tears from his eyes. He caught her looking and gave her a warm smile, so different from the cold businessman she'd first met. "By the power vested in me," the officiant concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Again." Laughter rippled through the gathering. "You may kiss your bride." John drew her close, one hand cradling her face, while the other rested protectively over their children. When their lips met, Lucy felt the difference from their first wedding kiss. No performance, no calculation, just pure, honest love. The small reception that followed was filled with joy and laughter. Claire danced with Abdul, who surprised everyone with his grace on the dance floor. Daniel gave a touching toast about watching his sister find real love in the most unexpected place. Even Barbara Maxwell shed her society matron persona to share stories about watching their love story unfold. As the evening drew to a close, John led Lucy to a quiet corner of the garden. The stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "More than I ever thought possible." She leaned back against him, their hands joining over the twins. "Though your daughters are apparently celebrating by practicing their dance moves." "Sons," he corrected with a smile, "and they're just expressing their joy. Either way, they're definitely alpha him already, making their presence known." John turned her in his arms, his expression growing serious. "I have something for you." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. Inside, Lucy found the deed to a foundation, the Adrian Alpha Him Memorial Research Fund. "The board approved it this morning," he explained. "All the proceeds from the Richardson settlement, plus matching funds from Alpha Him Industries. It will support both cancer research and corporate ethics investigations." "John," she breathed, understanding the significance. "It's a way to honor both our stories, Adrian's fight for truth and your mother's battle with cancer. Something positive from all the pain." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "And someday we'll tell our children about their uncle who helped make it possible. And about their father," Lucy added, "who was brave enough to choose love over appearance, truth over convenience. And about their mother," he smiled, "who taught a cynical businessman how to believe in love again." As if in response, both twins moved strongly, making Lucy laugh. "I think they're endorsing this plan." "Of course they are." John drew her close again. "They're the product of this love story after all." Later that night, as they lay in bed in what would soon be their new home, Lucy thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that first meeting in his office to this moment, with his hand resting protectively over their growing children. They had transformed a business arrangement into something beautiful and real. "What are you thinking about?" John murmured against her hair. "About how sometimes the best contracts are the ones we break," she replied, turning to face him. "And how love doesn't need conditions to flourish." "No conditions," he agreed, kissing her softly. "Just us, our family, and all the wonderful unplanned moments ahead." As Lucy drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she smiled at the thought of their future, a future built not on careful arrangements and maintained appearances, but on the strongest foundation of all, love freely given and joyfully received.